take you back about 23 years or so. I was 5 years old and growing up on a nice quiet neighborhood street in New Jersey. While I enjoyed playing outside just as much as any other kid, well, maybe not as much, but I wasn't a complete shut-in. I had taken a keen interest in video games, which I had seen at department stores, on TV, and at friends' houses. The most popular one at the time was the brand new Nintendo 64, which sported amazing 3D graphics, 4 controller ports for co-op play, and a controller whose design still boggles my mind to this very day. In hindsight, it's actually pretty funny that Nintendo is known for one of the best controllers and one of the worst. My mother was kind of apprehensive about letting me have a video game console, as video games were still pretty new back then. Nobody knew if they did any long-term damage to children's eyes, or if they would suddenly cause kids to not want to do anything else but play video games. Still, I persisted, so my mom let me dip my toes into the gaming waters by letting me rent consoles from Blockbuster Video. During this time, I tried out the Sega Genesis, the Sony PlayStation, and of course, the Nintendo 64. While I enjoyed all three of them, I had my heart set on the Nintendo 64, so my mom gave in and got me one that following Christmas with Diddy Kong Racing. The rest, you can say, is history. Now, why am I telling that story in a video about the Sega Saturn? Well, I can honestly say that for the duration of my childhood and even the early teenage years, I didn't even know that the Saturn had existed. For the longest time, I had thought Sega made the Genesis and then went straight to the Dreamcast. After all, literally no one I talked to at school or at home ever mentioned the Sega Saturn, and I never saw it at any store, though the fact that my nearest toy store was a KB Toys might have had something to do with it, and I'll get back to that. The point being is that I only became aware of its existence when, one day much later, I was digging through the basement of the two-family home I lived in and saw this very dusty black box with a top-loading disc drive. I could see just beyond it a box that said Sega Saturn on it with a picture of a blocky looking fighting game called Virtua Fighter. It did pique my interest for a few minutes there, but rather than ask the guy living upstairs if I could buy it off of him, I just left it alone and went about my business. Man, if only I knew then. Fast forward to maybe about 6 or so months ago, and at this point I knew of the Saturn's existence, but only really in context of my favorite Sega console, the Dreamcast. I knew that the Saturn had failed in the United States, which caused Sega to rush out the Dreamcast, which caused it to be massacred by the PlayStation 2 on both a software and hardware level. I knew that the purple guy that you saw while playing at the casino level in Sonic Adventure was a character from a Saturn game called Nights into Dreams, and I had known that the game I had bought for Xbox called Panzer Dragoon Orta was from a series that originated on the Saturn. I knew quite a bit at this point, but I wanted to know more. So I dug into Saturn-related content on YouTube and learned the general story of the Saturn. For those of you unfamiliar with it, the Sega Saturn launched in 1995 in the US, and it launched a full 3 months before it was supposed to as a desperate attempt to gain market share prior to the PlayStation's launch. This launch was a surprise that was announced at E3 that year. Imagine that. Imagine Sony walking out on the stage at E3 next year and saying, the PlayStation 5 is $399 and is available in stores today at select retailers. Sure, people would lose their minds, and people did when Sega did this with the Saturn, but there was an unfortunate consequence to this move. See, Sega only had limited stock of the Saturn at launch, so certain retailers were left out of the launch altogether and didn't receive stock for months. One of these retailers was KB Toys, who refused to stock anything Sega Saturn related after that. Makes a lot more sense that I hadn't heard of the Saturn during my childhood with that in mind, doesn't it? For whatever reason, I can't help but be fascinated by the story of Sega post their success with the Genesis, and particularly the era of the Saturn. While most could argue that the Dreamcast had its fate sealed before it even launched, the Saturn was coming off of the heels of the Genesis, which was, and still is, Sega's greatest triumph. Looking into the absolute disaster that was this console in the US at least, is truly one of the most interesting stories in gaming history. There were so many times where Sega could have made a different decision that would have vastly transformed today's gaming landscape. To put it in the simplest way possible, had Sega changed one decision and accepted Sony's partnership offer to help out with the Saturn, then you would all likely be playing games like Insomniac's Spider-Man and the new God of War on the Sega Dreamcast 4. Well, if Sega were in control, then it probably wouldn't be called that, but the point is that Sega would be where Sony is today. You, person watching this video, would have been playing games like Crash Bandicoot, Final Fantasy VII, and Metal Gear Solid on the Sega Saturn. Man, and people thought Final Fantasy on a Sony console was weird. So finally, curiosity got the best of me and I purchased a Sega Saturn at a gaming convention along with 4 games: Sonic 3D Blast, Bug, Panzer Dragoon Zwei, and I got Sega Rally for free just for buying the console. I'd never seen the console up close before, and I gotta say I really dig the design of it. It's a little bit taller than the PlayStation, but it feels very sturdy and has some cool aesthetic etchings on it that give it a bit of a 90s futuristic look. It has a cartridge slot, which I originally thought was for Sega Genesis games, but it's actually for additional RAM, like the N64 expansion pack. While the RAM idea is cool, again, the system probably would have sold better here in the US if it did play Genesis games. The controller, well, I got the 2nd generation controller, so I couldn't try the launch version, but wow. This controller is a fantastic retro gamepad. This controller fits perfectly in the hand, has nice tactile buttons, a decent D-pad, and okay trigger buttons. At this time period, no one had really figured out trigger buttons, so I won't slam Sega on that, though it is odd that they're marked on the controller as skip track buttons. Regardless, I see a console that could have stood toe-to-toe with PlayStation and N64 in the West, especially with them pulling a DualShock and making a controller with an analog stick. So the system seems to hold up, but what about the games? Well, let's take a look. First off, I captured this gameplay via an AV to HDMI adapter that doesn't have a 4x3 option, so I'm sorry if this looks a little stretched, but it was my only option. Okay, let's move on to the games in order of quality, a top 4 list of sorts, I guess. Coming in at number 4 is Bug. Bug was Sega's attempt to create a new mascot for the Saturn, as it looked like a new Sonic game was going to arrive a few years into the console's life. In fact, a new Sonic platformer never even made it to the Saturn, so we have Bug instead. Bug is a 3D-ish platformer that stars a bug who is filming a movie about his girlfriend being kidnapped. The main mechanics of Bug are your typical 2D platformer fare: jump on enemies to kill them, grab health packs, and try to navigate your way to the other side of the level. Bug slightly differs in that the perspective shifts from 2D to this weird 3D where you're still on a set track but moving on a 3D plane. Aesthetically speaking, Bug is a good looking game for that time period. 3D looked a lot worse on some other titles, so I'm not complaining. What I will complain about though is this game's soundtrack. That first level's music is not too great on the ears, and even worse, it's pretty short and loops a lot. Granted, it's not awful like something in the realm of Bubsy 3D, but coming off of the Sonic titles, this is a huge step down. To continue to compare this to the Sonic titles, the platforming, while functional, has some issues. I feel like some hitboxes are not super precise, which forces you to stop and plan out jumps on occasion to make sure you hit the target correctly. This kind of ends up making Bug a much tougher game than I feel it was intended to be. Even after owning this game for a month and having quite a few hours to put into it, I only just recently managed to get out of the first world in Seksha. This really could be attributed to the spacing of the checkpoints, as they seem just a little too far apart. Regardless, the game feels more difficult than it really should be. Good thing there's plenty of bug juice around.
Wow! Bug juice!
And number 3 is Sonic 3D Blast. Sonic 3D Blast was released on Sega Saturn and Genesis in 1996 and was the first Sonic game to arrive on the Saturn. It was by no means a reason to buy a Saturn alone because, well, 1, the game was also available on the Genesis, and 2, the game is just okay. This was the first attempt to bring Sonic into the 3D realm, and the result was a game with very floaty feeling controls and difficult depth perception. The developers compensated for this by making the levels more spread out and minimize penalties for mistakes. Whereas a game like Bug would punish you for missing a jump by letting you fall to your death, Sonic 3D Blast plays solid ground beneath most of its jumps with an easy way to get back up to give the player pretty much unlimited chances to navigate these more difficult sections. Mind you, they aren't difficult because of the complexity or anything like that. It is simply a depth perception thing, as it's hard to tell how far you have to jump to make it from platform to platform. Luckily, these levels don't have a ton of jumping sections in them. The game also has these bonus levels which play just like the bonus levels in the original game, where you run through a half pipe picking up rings in an effort to get the Chaos Emerald at the end. It's largely the same as prior games, with the exception of one thing that is a huge plus for the game: the soundtrack. Sonic 3D Blast has a great soundtrack. The Saturn version especially was starting to dip into the tracks that we'd see more frequently in the Sonic Adventure series and onward, although no Crush 40 unfortunately. It is thoroughly a 90s OST, and even though I've never played this game before, I still felt nostalgic listening to it. Finally, Sonic 3D Blast is not the best looking game, and heck, it's not even the best looking Sonic game on this console. This most likely had to do with the fact that this game also had to come out on the Genesis, which was at that point in 1996, 8-year-old hardware. The Saturn version of this game is a significant improvement over the Genesis version, with more detailed textures, some weather effects, and a smoother frame rate. Overall, it's not a bad game, but that's also coming from a huge Sonic fan, so take that with a grain of salt on your chili dog. At number 2, we have Sega Rally Championship. This was the free game that I got from the vendor at the convention just for buying the Saturn. I had a choice between this or the Lost World Jurassic Park game, so I expected both to be kind of garbage. After all, I was getting it for free, so it couldn't be that good, right? I had heard of Sega Rally before though, so I picked up that one and braced for the somewhat rough driving experience. I mean, 3D driving on a D-pad? Yikes. So I booted the game and tried to practice drive in the desert stage, which was marked easy. The race started and... that's the track for this one. You have my attention, Sega Rally. One thing that I and probably a lot of people forget is that Sega was actually an arcade gaming company at heart. In fact, most of their hardware was sold with the idea of bringing the arcade experience home, which makes a lot of sense to me now as an adult. Sega Rally is a prime example of this, and I can 100% picture myself tearing it up in this game in an arcade in the 90s. Granted, I'm a terrible driver in these games as I often rely on the barriers to be my brakes, but I still really enjoy this game. I almost wish I could get my hands on one of these control pads with thumbsticks so I can really dive into this. Guess I'll have to settle for Sega Rally 2 on the Dreamcast. And finally, the number 1 is Panzer Dragoon 2 Zwei. This game. This was the game that made me realize that I had missed out on the Saturn when it first launched. Panzer Dragoon 2 Zwei is an on-rail shooter where you play as Jean-Luc Lundy and his trusty dragon-looking Kulia, Lagi. Lundy lives in a village that raises Kulia but kills the mutant ones as they are seen as a bad omen. Lundy, unable to kill a mutant Kulia, hides it in his home and names it Lagi. Eventually, Lagi grows wings, so Lundy tries to teach it to fly. While out training, a huge ship called the Shellkoof attacks Lundy's village, and instead of the usual lengthy first level where you have to defend the doomed village, the Shellkoof just obliterates the entire village before you even knew it hit you. From there, you embark on a mission that Lundy isn't quite calling revenge, but it's totally revenge. You and Lagi shoot your way through the first levels, and I noticed that Lagi seems to evolve a bit after completing these chapters and takes on a very different look by around chapter 4. Another cool mechanic in this game is the branching path system, which is very reminiscent of Star Fox. I didn't even realize that this was a thing until I went to record this footage and found myself in this cavern fighting a giant fish that I'd never seen before instead of a fortress-looking boss that I remember from my first playthrough. The gameplay of Panzer Dragoon 2 definitely feels the tightest out of the 4 games that I'm showing here. The cursor moves fast enough so you can hit incoming projectiles, the lock-on system works fine, and there's a special move if you hit the X button, which fires this rapid fire attack that is super useful in this game's boss fights. Again, making a comparison to Star Fox, giant bosses wait for you at the end of each chapter, and you have certain patterns and weaknesses that you have to exploit to defeat them. They are challenging, but not impossible. It's that sort of difficulty that beats you up on occasion, but makes you want to try again, and I really like that. At the end of the day, Panzer Dragoon 2 Zwei doesn't just hold up in the context of 90s 3D games, it holds up as just a video game in general, and I definitely recommend it to anyone that is a fan of these rail-type shooter games. I spent about $200 on all of this, with the most expensive parts being the console itself and Panzer Dragoon 2 Zwei. With that said, I am completely happy with my purchase, and I intend to dive more into Saturn in the future. This is the first retro console that I bought that I didn't have as a kid, and it's been a really interesting experience. I got to immerse myself into a time period that I was there for, but try something that almost never crossed my mind back then. I almost wish I had heard of it back then, as a lot of the games that I want to play now cost hundreds of dollars because of the product scarcity due to the Saturn's poor performance in the US. While the outcome of this console was kind of inevitable after all of the awful decisions made by Sega during that time, I can't help but feel the tragicness of the Saturn's fate, as it is a great console. With that said, I feel pretty confident in saying that I will return to the Saturn at some point in the future for another video, but for now, we move forward. See you guys next time!